Okay, in this lecture, I'm going to discuss the basics of program development. Most, if not all, the references that we have for project or program development and management geared towards the fields of business and community projects. But here in this lecture, we will try to contextualize general terms and processes of program development and program management in language education. Let's first understand what program development is. As defined, program development is essentially a roadmap, an action plan that provides the guidance needed to develop and build effective educational programs. Like lesson plans in classes, program development plans provide for teachers and program implementers clear direction to address the educational needs of the learners, or even in this case, specifically the language proficiency needs. It is continually improved, like lesson plans, because even in actual implementation of the programs, there will be tendencies for alterations, modifications, accommodations based on the reception and responses of the students. That's why it is an ongoing and continuous process. It is important that during the program development planning, we understand the general steps that we need to take to begin the program implementation cycle and to end the program implementation cycle. Here we have questions to be addressed during the planning process. Like all program development plans, we always begin with questions on the conduct of needs assessment. We ask, for example, what language problems of the students do the school or the English department need to address? Is it lack of language proficiency in general, or specifically lack of reading literacy? Right? What populations are at greatest risk? Are we talking about our intake of grade 7? Are we talking about our graduating students? What are its met needs, for example? Um, in terms of language proficiency in general, do we think that all the macro skills have been met except for reading? What are its unmet needs? Are we only talking about reading literacy or reading proficiency, right? The second step is developing of goals. In this step, we ask the question, what results can be achieved in the next year, or what result can be achieved after the implementation of the program? And if we plan to implement the program for a period of time, like in 3 years, what do we expect um, as results after the 3 year implementation? Do we expect a specific trend? Do we expect for an increased trend? Do we expect for um, an evaluation that would identify the weaknesses of the program that we can improve for the next 3 years of its implementation? The next step after developing the goals is identifying the resources. What resources does the program need to achieve its goals? It's one thing to ask what specific resources the program needs. It's another thing to ask whether these resources are available in our schools, right? Another question, what social networks, educational institutions, businesses, or other community building activities are available to address the problems? What community needs and community resources can we use as resources to help us in the implementation of the program? The next step is, how do we assign leadership tasks, right? Who will be responsible for each part of the program? Who will be responsible for the planning? Do we build a reading program committee, for example, who's responsible for the implementation of the program? Do we build an evaluator, a team of evaluators after the program implementation to evaluate our program? So these are questions that we need to ask under assigning leadership tasks. How will the program be led and coordinated? We also have to identify in this part of the process who will be involved in the program, and how will we be able to coordinate possible offices that will be affected by our program. The next step is implementation, linkages, and collaborations. After identifying what offices in our school are involved in our program, we then have to describe at least the kind of relationship we need with these offices. For example, mag-collaborate ba ta sa ilahang manpower, mag-collaborate ba ta sa ilahang facilities, right? Does this program fit with other programs that are existing in our school? Kay basig na ay times na mag-implement og program sa language proficiency, pero ang ubang programs di ay sa ubang disciplines kay nag-incorporate na pod og language proficiency. What procedures will keep the program on track? How do we make sure that our collaborations with other offices will continue on in the succeeding implementation of the program? Ang next nato na step is identify funding sources. It's important that in our proposal we specify explicitly the budget we have for the program. Kailangan ba ito mo palit og learning materials, maing anagot, para ma-inform nato or at least makabalo ang ato ang management if kailangan jud ba og funding for the implementation of our program. And then we conduct evaluation. How can we determine whether we have met our objectives? So sa objectives na atong giset sa plan nato sa atong program, how will we be able to measure the achievement of these objectives? And do we add, for example, qualitative measures so that we can characterize better or describe better the perceptions, experiences, sense of satisfaction of our students? Lastly, program revision. After the evaluation, how can we, based on the result, improve the program? Here, we will try to be more specific and delve deeper into what we call the 7-step model in program development. Always, ang first step nato is ang conduct of needs assessment. But specifically, the task that we have for this step is really to describe our target audience. Kinsa man ang recipient sa atong language program or kinsa man atong recipient sa atong intervention program. For example, ang recipient pa nato kay grade 7 nagikan sa elementary school nila. Naa ba sila specific na mga language needs na kailangan nato i-address before sila mo continue sa atong high school? Or maybe ang atong recipient kay grade 10 na padulungay pag senior high, or maybe our recipient kay ang grade 12 na graduating students na padulungay na mo mag-college na pwede pa nato matabangan in terms of their language proficiency. And then after identifying our recipient for the program, we also have to specifically identify unsa ang problems ang kailangan nato i-address. But usually, I think, based on the reading program of the Department of Education, the National Reading Program, ang reading comprehension and reading literacy usually ang naay problem sa ato mga estudyante. And then we try to describe the planning process, the program planning process that we will undergo, and the type of needs for our agency to address the actual problem that we identified. So ang involved aning process sa conduct of needs assessment usually is the coordinator in the Department of Education. If reading ang problem nato, then probably ang atong reading coordinator. Or if there is a committee for such programs, then probably they have to really meet and convene so that they can better understand the conduct of the needs assessment for the students. The typical next step for program development is the development of mission, goals, and objectives. But I think in the context of language programs, especially in the Department of Education or in education in general, we usually just write the rationale and then the objectives of our program. Here, specifically, we develop the goals that accurately reflect potential solutions to the problems found during the needs assessment, establish realistic goals that describe how the program will affect the target population. So, we always have to base our decision and formulation of the objectives on the needs assessment. Or if we did not conduct a needs assessment, if we only have a baseline data, then everything that we formulate as objectives should be tailor-fitted to addressing the needs of the students or the recipients of our program. And these goals have to be realistic, for the span and timeline of the program that we declared. Later on, we will try to discuss more in terms of the program implementation and the timeline. The key players responsible for this step are, for example, the program committee or the specific coordinator of the program as assigned. The next step is the identification of funding sources. Depende ni siya if ang atong school nagahatag indeed og funding sources sa ato ang program implementation, or I think if sa public schools ka dili yata kailangan og funding sources because the implementation of these programs will always be part of the remuneration of the teachers. But if ever we teach in private schools and we need to include in our plan or proposal budgetary requirements, we have to really determine how much money is needed for the program implementation and develop a list of funding sources or possible funding sources. And of course, ang key players responsible ani kay katong mga involved sa finances for the program. And of course, our managers, maybe supervisors, middle managers, who will approve the budgetary requirement for the program. And then in the assignment of the leadership task, we identify perspectives and people who will lead each step of the program. I think usually naam kita isa ka program coordinator jud, and then the program coordinator will then delegate the task to the members of the program committee. For example, lahi ang i-assign sa logistics, lahi ang i-assign sa coordination sa other offices, and then lahi ang i-assign sa actual program implementation, lahi po ang i-assign sa mag-develop of evaluation and assessment, lahi po ang mag-assign sa or i-assign sa planning of the program and the proposal for submission sa ato ang department chair or sa ato ang principal, and etc. So we really have to identify the key people or key persons that will do specific tasks for our program. And then in the design of the program, we need to establish the details of the actual program pag isulat na nato siya into proposal. Unsa ba iyang rationale, unsa ba iyang objectives, unsa ba ang iyang program implementation, how do we assess and evaluate the achievement of the objectives that we set, and how do we package the program in such a way na ma-approve siya sa ato ang principal or ma-approve siya sa ato ang directors, right? Describe your staffing needs, determine how you will evaluate it and how much it will cost, create budget that includes salaries and benefits if ever kailangan og honorarium or remuneration sa atong i-invite na mga speakers or include na mga faculty members sa ato ang program. How do we share the cost? What is the program cost and what are the indirect costs like sa learning materials or ang classrooms na ato ang magamit for the implementation of the program. And then we implement the program. Sa program implementation, usually kailangan jud na naatay means of verification. So if naatay student journalists, we can ask them to do media campaigns for us, maybe take photos para sa implementation mismo natay ma-attach sa atong reports. And then maybe we can ask student volunteers to help with the manpower of the actual implementation. And then we can develop collaborations in the implementation of the activities that we have for the program. So of course, ang in charge ana ang program coordinator, ang faculty members involved in the conduct of the program. And lastly, we end with the program evaluation or evaluating the program. We identify how we will verify documents for the program in preparation of our report and qualify program activities and their effects. We need to also evaluate whether or not the learning activities that we planned have indeed been implemented in the program, and whether or not the implementation of these activities have indeed been helpful in the achievement of the objectives that we've formulated for the program and for the students. Now, let's delve deeper into the needs assessment. In general, needs assessment determines what programs and services our students need. But in this case, because we are very specific, we presume that our students need to improve their language proficiency or need to enrich their language proficiency. So our programs and specifically our program implementation and services should tailor fit to the needs of the students to improve their language proficiency. Conducting needs assessment also provide planners with the information needed to prioritize goals according to the identified needs. Again, it's extremely important that before we formulate the objectives for our language programs, we really need to tailor fit the formulation of these objectives and these objectives to the needs of our students or the language proficiency needs of our students para dili pud siya kumbaga useless and para ang program nato muhaom jud siya or mo tailor jud siya or mo target jud siya dito sa specific na mga problematic areas sa atong mga students in terms of their language proficiency. Our reference suggests 4 steps in needs assessment process, which are: first, we need to identify who will conduct the study, and second, what kind of information needs to be collected. So kani siya, if we are going to conduct a language intervention program, what kind of information do we need to make sure that we can formulate the objectives for the program? Do we need test scores? Do we need feedback from the teachers? Do we need key informants that will tell us that our students are indeed struggling? Do we need to survey our students and ask their perception if they need to be recipients of a language program? Kana siya. But I think most definitely we need actual language proficiency assessments as basis to formulate our objectives for our language program. How will the information be collected? Do we need surveys for the collection of these data? Do we conduct and administer examinations or language proficiency examinations? Do we only get the data from the final examinations of our students or the results of the first examination? So these kinds of things will have to be considered in terms of identifying the type of data needed so that we can be informed of the needs of our students. How will the information be used? Do we use the information as baseline data for our post-test, or do we use the information only so that we can formulate the objectives of our program? So these are questions that we need to consider under the needs assessment. After we've identified the type of data that we will be using as baseline or basis for the formulation of our objectives, we then have to develop our goals and objectives. It has always been a default, especially in making lesson plans, for teachers to set realistic goals, and we need to be able to apply the same practice when we implement or plan for a language program. In the development of language programs, establishing realistic goals that describe how a program will affect its target population is essential to solving the identified problems. One way of doing this, or establishing realistic goals, is to really follow the SMART principle, which we will discuss in the succeeding slide. Another is to ensure really that the goals and objectives that we will set really should tailor fit or are tailor fitted or are based solely on the results of our needs analysis or the baseline data that we identified for in the needs assessment for our program. We then have to develop specific strategies, or at least in the formulation of the objectives, we must have in mind specific approaches, methods, strategies, and techniques that are needed to achieve the goals that we've set based on evidence about methods that have demonstrated success with the program's target population. Here is where our expertise in language teaching and learning comes in. For example, in formulating objectives and in envisioning the program implementation, we have to know all the possible approaches, methods, strategies, and techniques as options to best address the specific language needs of our students. For example, if they lack grammatical competence, and with a very short period allotted for our program, we then can use, based on the features of this method, we can then use direct method. If they have issues in terms of reading comprehension, we must identify at this early on in the process of developing the program if students need, for example, intensive reading or extensive reading. If this is an issue on reading time, that's why we have implemented, for example, the Drop Everything and Read program of the Department of Education. If this is an issue on phonics, then we have to make sure that we use, for example, sight words or the teaching of sight words as much as possible. Um, these approaches, methods, strategies, and techniques have to be already considered even in the formulation of objectives for the program. In our reference, the SMART principle does not necessarily apply to the specific statements of our objectives, but I think this applies to the general language program from the first sections to the last, right? So specific involves variables such as identifying who is involved, who are the recipients. We have to specify what we want to accomplish using by formulating objectives and goals. We have to specify where will we locate the program, or where is the program located, how will we be able to implement the program, when do we expect for the program to complete, what are the requirements and the possible challenges or constraints in the implementation of the program. And we have to identify or at least rationalize the reasons, purpose, or benefit of accomplishing the goals that we have set for the program. It has to be measurable as well. How much or how much do we need to implement the program? How many manpower do we need? How many students should be involved in the program? Agreeable. Do team members agree with the goal? Will our committee formulate the goals based on the agreed results of the needs analysis, for example? Is it realistic? Is it doable? Is it feasible? And do we have a clear timeline for our implementation? In identifying funding sources, the success of our program may very well depend on the ability to obtain resources to support programmatic mission, goals, and objectives. So identifying funding sources is a very important step in the program planning process. I think this is only applicable for institutions that really require budgetary requirements for their proposals to be approved by their administrators. But I think in the context of the Department of Education, I suppose that funding sources is really not an issue. In terms of assigning leadership tasks, here are the factors that influence good leadership that we have to consider. First, the commitment of our program leader or project leader. The project leader must be committed to achieving a vision that have enough motivation to initiate action required, because sometimes implementing a program or an educational program in schools might be very taxing. So we need a leader or a program coordinator that is committed to the implementation and continuation of the program. Is the coordinator willing to be democratic in a school with teachers who have different perspectives and different approaches to addressing language problems? Are our leaders or is the program coordinator open to suggestion from the different perspectives of the teachers? Is the program coordinator good in communication and listening skills? Because project management really requires clear communication from the program coordinators or the leaders? Are they competent? Because they are really going to make decisions for the team and for the program. If they do not have competence in terms of implementation, in terms of management, in terms of supervision, and even in terms of the language teaching and learning, they cannot really fully um, or at least effectively lead the implementation of the program and support of others. Um, will the program coordinator be able to support the members of the committee of the program or the teachers who are involved in the program in cases where they needed support, or in cases where they need support, or in cases where they encounter specific problems? Murag ma-create ba sa ato ang program coordinator or leader ang space where support is evident, na maging open ang ato ang mga members or teachers who are involved in the program in raising their concerns. It's different when teachers are free to raise their concerns early on in the implementation, so that the leadership and the committee or the program coordinator will have the time to solve these kinds of problems. Let's now proceed to program design. In program design planning, there has to be a plan or a proposal with project specific objectives and key action steps that are specific and measurable. At a minimum, the plan or the proposal should include a problem statement or a longer version of a problem statement, the rationale. There has to also be goals within the rationale. There also has to be explicit and specific objectives for each goal identified. Key action steps for each goal or objective have to also be included. The people responsible for each action step, the target completion dates of the activities to be implemented, and the methods for evaluating each objectives. So these components have to be at least present in the proposal or the plan for the program. Let's now proceed to program implementation. In terms of program implementation, we focus on developing procedures for carrying out specific tasks or activities. So at this stage, we should have already determined our goals and formulated our objectives, and we will have already identified the types of activities for our program that we will implement. We should also have already identified and acquired the necessary resources, and our leadership structure should already be in place. But it is impossible to ensure that nothing will go wrong in the actual implementation of the program, specifically if a lot of people are involved, not only teachers but also students. We have to have a reasonable amount of assurance that everything will operate well, because then we know specifically, if the structure is clear for our program implementation, how will we mitigate problems or solve problems immediately. Planning must also include the development of procedures that ensure the success of our activities when there are unexpected situations or problems or circumstances that might be at play during the implementation of the program. After the program implementation, we then have to evaluate our program, not only in terms of identifying whether the learning activities have in fact been implemented, but also whether or not we've achieved the objectives that we have put in place for the program. In conducting evaluations, these are few of the many questions that we need to revisit. First, what do we want to accomplish? We need to revisit again our goals and the objectives that we formulated for our program. What are we doing to accomplish these objectives and goals? We need to revisit whether we've accomplished and implemented all the activities that we have identified, or all the tasks that we have to do for the program. What have we accomplished? So we need to again revisit whether all of the activities have been implemented, whether all the tasks have been implemented. What are we trying to change? If we are conducting a language program to increase the reading competence of the students, have we indeed achieved an increase of reading competence? Is there a change in terms of their reading competence? If our language program is focused on enhancing speaking skills, is there a change or an improvement in terms of students' speaking skills? Right? How will we know whether we are successful? So we need to revisit our tools for assessing and evaluating the achievement of our objectives, and we need to also revisit our tools in assessing and evaluating whether or not our students have really improved their language proficiency or language skills or reading comprehension or a specific language competence that we identified for the program. In terms of conducting evaluations, we need to condition ourselves and our team to treat program evaluation as not designed to be judgmental or to assess personal competence or individual performance, not only of students, but more on the personal competence of the implementers of the program and the program coordinator, or the individual performance of the program or the program coordinator. In general, evaluation is designed to verify, document, and quantify activities and their effects. So, if we have certain activities that would target, for example, a specific language proficiency, we evaluate to determine whether or not these activities have indeed contributed to, for example, an increase of language proficiency or reading competence. Often, although program staff believes that a program works because common sense shows it to be successful and they've watched it succeed, it is important to go by more than just anecdotal evidence of success. Sometimes, because we want for our programs to finish early, or we want to convince ourselves that our program or the program that we implemented are indeed successful, or programs that we implemented are indeed successful, we tend to find patterns that would support these kinds of biases. But it is very important that in the evaluation of our program, we need to be as objective as possible, and we need to use the tools that we have identified to determine really whether or not our program is successful in the achievement of the objectives and the goals. So how do we do that? We need to verify, because common sense usually turns out to be wrong. So we need to really follow the tools, the assessment tools and evaluations that we have put in place to be as objective as possible. We need to document, whether it is to funding agencies, other practitioners in the area, or lay audiences. Documentation provides evidence of accomplishment and results. Then, in our case, in education, I think this document means the report that we need to submit after the implementation of the program. And then we have to quantify. While we may have some general knowledge of what's going on, it is important to use numbers for support if we're trying to show that there is a problem, or at least if we're trying to show that our program was indeed effective in addressing the problem. I think we all have to agree that aside from the program implementation, the program evaluation is also labor intensive. It is critical that we create a step-by-step work plan for conducting the evaluation, especially when we want to be very specific and detail oriented in evaluating the activities that we conducted and implemented, and um, whether or not we achieve the objectives that we formulated and the goals that we formulated for the program. At the minimum, an evaluation of a program will require the following functions to be performed. First, we need to do evaluation planning. We need to formulate the overall evaluation instruments. How do we um, create tools so that we know, for example, the students' satisfaction in the delivery of the program? Two, whether the program implementation was successful. Three, whether we've achieved the objectives, the actual formulated objectives of the program. Second, data collection. In our formulation of the evaluation instruments, how do we plan to administer our surveys or questionnaires? How do we conduct interviews? How do we observe program operations? Or how do we review or enter data from existing data sources which we can use for the evaluation? And in terms of coding, how do we collate the information? How do we ensure that the information that we collected are accurate? And how do we um, prepare the data for data analysis? Is it statistical data? Is it qualitative data? Is it a mixture of the results of the students pre-test and post-test, or just a survey of whether or not they are satisfied, or is it just based on their perception um, or perception in terms of their increased language proficiency? So these considerations have to be included, right, in the steps. And then we do data analysis. How do we conduct either statistical analysis or thematic analysis um, on our data, or on the data that we collected for our evaluation? In conducting evaluations, we also have to consider the assessment of outcomes and the assessment of impact. Now, these two are two different assessments that we have to conduct. Outcome assessment looks at the short-term effect of our program. It is concerned with measuring the immediate effect of a program on the students who are subjected to our intervention or enhancement program. It attempts to determine the direct effects of the program, such as the degree to which the program increased knowledge of our students, proficiency of our students, or competency of our students. Now, outcome assessment. Outcome assessment is different from impact assessment, because impact assessment looks at the long-term or ultimate effects of the program that we implemented. For example, if we plan for our language program to be implemented for 3 years or 5 years, only after 3 years or 5 years do we need to do an impact assessment. So we have a data 3 different data points or 5 different data points, and we can do trend analysis of the program. In language proficiency enhancement programs, for example, the ultimate effect or the area one would like to impact include improvement in overall language proficiency levels of our students, or of all the participants of our students. Reduction in the number of students performing below competency standards. Do we see a downward trend indeed in terms of the trends of do we see a downward trends indeed of students requiring more interventions after the intervention? For example, an increase in number of learners actively participating in language development activities and seeking proficiency assessment. So these are just few of the examples that we can cite to measure whether or not there is indeed an impact um, with the program that we implemented to our students. Okay, let's recap the 7-step model of program development. Again, first we need to conduct needs assessment. We need to identify and describe the language needs of our students, or the aspect of language proficiency that they need to improve on. And then we need to develop goals and formulate objectives for our program that are based on the results and findings of our needs assessment and needs analysis. We then have to identify our resources, our manpower, facilities, and finances. And then we need to assign leadership tasks to specific personnel. And then we need to design the program. We need to identify the approach that we're going to use, the method in general, the strategies and techniques for our instructional delivery. And then we need to implement the program based on our design. And lastly, we need to evaluate the program, find assessment tools and strategies, and then evaluate the program based on the results of our assessment. That ends our discussion on this topic. This is our reference. Thank you so much for listening.